For those of you who don't know, our exhibit is titled City on Fire, Chicago 1871. And that's really because we wanted to take the opportunity um, to, to transport our audience back into the city at the time, and really sort of give them a immersive experience that allowed them to place themselves in Chicago during October of 1871. Imagine being chased by fire. It's big, it's fast, it destroys everything in its path. You must leave most of your things behind, your home, clothes, and even your toys. Anything you can't grab burns. The most important thing is to survive. This is what it's like during the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. It is a disaster. When a disaster happens, people have to make choices about what to save and where to go. For people with more money or influence, survival and recovery is made easier. For people with less money or influence, requests for aid are treated with suspicion. But in the end, Chicago and its people will rebuild. So this is our introductory label for the exhibition, and there's a lot to unpack here. The first and foremost is that we really wanted to create, as I mentioned earlier, an immersive experience. We wanted people to imagine what these experiences was like. I always joke, I have never written the word imagine so many times as I have working on this exhibition, because we're constantly trying to create that emotional, empathetic connection and get people to put themselves in the shoes and in perspectives of people going through something like the Great Chicago Fire. And we also wanted to focus on, because of its salience to our contemporary moment, disaster preparedness, recovery, and we'll get more into those ideas during the presentation. And then we also wanted to talk about issues of inequity, how people go through the same experiences, but experiences those things differently. And that was something that came to us as a consequence of the COVID-19 pandemic, which was going on as we were developing this exhibition. Obviously remains with us. And we were struck by how much people were talking about the inequities that the pandemic exposed, that were long-standing prior to the onset. And what was striking when we were looking at the historical record for the Great Chicago Fire is in 1871, absolutely no one was talking like that, right? And in fact, they went about to reestablish the pre-fire status quo in a lot of ways, to sort of re-entrench the inequalities and inequities that existed. And so that was a fascinating historical contrast that we wanted to elevate in the exhibition. So the exhibition itself is into four sections, and the first section being the wooden city. And really wanted to impress upon people what Chicago was like in October of 1871. And the most striking thing to us was that Chicago was a city made of wood. Not only were the homes primarily made of wood, but streets were made of wood paver blocks, sidewalks were wood plank sidewalks, water pipes were made of wood, even in the city. And we have all these things in our collection, so we could point out to people just how much of the city was built of wood. And that was because that wood was an abundant and plentiful resource from the surrounding environs of Chicago, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And so we talk about, how Chicago's geographical centrality in the Midwest led to this abundance of wood, and its cheapness, its plentifulness, led to hastily building the city out of wood without a lot of concern for elements of safety. So we talk about how homes were what we would call balloon frame houses, very easily built and without the fire breaks in between the studs of walls, which help prevent fire from spreading up the shafts, essentially, of walls, almost like a chimney, right? So these homes, when they would catch on fire, because they lacked those fire breaks, the flames would literally just shoot up in between the studs of the wall, and they would burn very, very quickly. And so this was a huge fire safety hazard. Additionally, you had the use of roofing and other highly flammable materials just in abundance. It's hard to imagine now, but you had urban farming. So you had hay for your animals, and then those animals would eat that hay, and then they would have excrement, right, which is highly flammable. And a lot of people used coals as the primary method to heat their homes, which is highly flammable as well. So there's an abundance of flammable material around. And then in this section, we also wanted to talk about the inequalities that exist. And those are evidenced, I think, by these three different types of homes, right? So obviously, most prominently, you see the O'Leary cottage, which is actually two cottages connected together. The O'Learys lived in the rear cottage and actually rented out the front cottage to another family. And so small 2-room cottages, which was typical of, of immigrants like the O'Learys. But then, as you see next to it, we have a much grander duplex, to use a contemporary term. And so really talking about the contrast of how people live differently in Chicago. And so in our interpretive approach and in our label approach, we asked a lot of open-ended questions, just like think about what people who would live in these different types of houses would do for a living, right? And then we have finally what we might think of as a more traditional 2-story home, and how someone may live in that. And so all of these things really point to, again, the pre-fire status quo, which was rebuilt after the fire. And so we wanted to give people that context. And then finally, in this section, we introduce people to the O'Learys, right? Patrick and Catherine O'Leary and their 5 children. And we wanted to remove Mrs. O'Leary from this sort of myth context, and introduce people to who this woman was, right? Her and her husband are immigrants. They were married in Ireland and immigrated together. They first settled in Pennsylvania, and Patrick was a veteran, having served and fought for the Union during the Civil War. They relocated to Chicago. They were active in their parish, which is still, their Church of the Holy Family. And they were, like many immigrants, Irish Catholic, non-English native speakers, and they were part of a group of people who were being blamed for a whole host of ills in Chicago in 1871. And so we wanted to introduce our guests to that context, because that sort of helps explain why the O'Leary myth takes on the life of its own. Because in a lot of ways, Mrs. O'Leary is a stand-in, right? She represents a group of people who are being blamed for the fire. And so when people are blaming Mrs. O'Leary, they're not blaming her, they're blaming people like her, because people like her are responsible for the decline and the decay of the city. And so we wanted to set all that context, right? Because that sort of then explains what happens after the fire in a lot of ways. And so And in the exhibit, you see a scene that we have, which is the O'Leary barn, the O'Leary kitchen, and you look through a window, and you see a barn catching on fire. And this is where we start the actual fire story, which goes into our second section, which is the burning city, right? And here we also wanted to dispel some myths. The chief one was that Chicago was unprepared for the fire. Chicago was not unprepared for the fire, right? Chicago had a professional fire department, which had the latest firefighting technology, which was coal-powered steam water pumpers, which we have on the screen. And Chicago also had what at the time was a very elaborate alarm system. And we actually have one of the alarms from the period in question. And we explained how they worked, and how there was this elaborate communication system using telegraph, Morse code, to communicate the alarm box based on number, and how the courthouse bell would ring to alert people to the location of the alarm box and the fire. And so there was a pretty robust system designed to fight the fire. But the problem was that fires were so frequent and common in Chicago in 1871 that much of the equipment was failing. Then you have the fatigue of constantly fighting the fire, fighting fires. There was a major fire in a lumber yard the night before this fire. And so that human error and that erosion of capacity based on the fire, when this happens, they actually think it's the lumberyard fire restarting. They ring the wrong alarm box number, sending the fire department in the wrong direction. And those precious moments allow, which was in many ways a remarkably common occurrence, which was something catching on fire in Chicago, to grow into a fire that was out of control. So that was the myth that we wanted to dispel there. And then the second thing we wanted to talk about was how fire works. What is fire? What are the physics of the fire? And so we actually partnered with the Chicago Fire Department, and they were instrumental in helping us think about communicating these ideas to the fire, about fire safety. And they really worked to help us craft a video that could explain what fire is, how fire works, right? That you need fuel, oxygen, and heat to have a fire, right? And those things were in abundance in Chicago on this night, and how the wind and the weather caused the fire to be able to literally swirl in the clouds, leaping from building to building, crossing the Chicago River twice. And so we have these beautiful lithographs that you see that sort of shows this idea of fire in the sky, right? And how people would work and imagine that experience. And then finally, we have the fleeing of the fire, right? So what do you do now? You're being chased by fire. The fire is literally leaping from building to building, coming towards you, and it's, where do you go? What do you do? What do you take with you? What do you leave behind? And so we have a large video, and all of our videos were done by Emmanuel Cinema. And if you've seen the newest adaptation of Candyman, their work is prominently featured in that film, because they're immensely a talented group of puppeteers, right? They use paper puppets to film their work, and so it was great. But we have a fleeing the fire video where you see people going through these ideas and making these decisions. Additionally, we have a video that's about the courthouse scene, and this is a famous story in which, at the time, the jail in Chicago was located in the basement of the courthouse. And so you have prisoners who are looking out the window, seeing the fire coming towards them, and they have to decide the authorities, and some people have said it's the mayor, but other people have disputed that account since then. But someone in authority has to decide to let them out. And so we often ask groups, we often ask children, what would you do in this situation? Would you let the prisoners out? Would you leave them in the jail? And so you have this video installation that we actually have two monitors, one above where you see the decision makers debating this, and one below where you see the prisoners waiting for their fate. And spoiler alert, they allow the prisoners to escape. They literally just turn them loose, open the jail, and let them run off. But it is a fascinating moment of drama there. And finally, one of the things we did to create that empathy, that connection, is there are character spotlights, and though Leary's being the first one, but there are 7 in total. And in this section, we actually have 4 character spotlights. We have young girls like Claire Ennis and Fannie Bell Becker. And one of the interesting things about them is when you read their stories, you again notice class differences between these 2 young women. You know, one who has sort of a lot of stuff, and they have to sort of deal with how they're going to get all this stuff that they have, her and her mother, out of their home. And then you have another one where they don't have a lot of stuff, and they sort of deal with that. And she ends up being separated from her family. So she talks about, running through the city, looking for them, in the fear that she has. We also have a famous story, a young boy named Justin who wrote a letter and drew a picture to a friend of his, describing the experience of the fire, and is actually quite amusing. His mom sort of catches on fire. They have to put her out, put the fire out on her. And he's sort of very nonchalantly, in a very childlike way, describes, oh yeah, and then mom's shirt caught on fire, we put her out. And he's talking about his pet goat that he has, and that they took with him. And so he drew this picture. We actually have the original letter and picture on display in the exhibit. And then finally we have the Hudlins, Joseph and Anna Elizabeth Hudlin, who are African American couple. Joseph had escaped from slavery, and he and his wife lived just outside of the Burn district, to the east towards the lake, and what we would now call the South Loop. And when the heard of the fire was happening, Anna Elizabeth opened her home to a group of people fleeing the fire, interracial group. And so she was heralded afterwards as the angel of the fire. And her husband, Joseph, had worked at a porter for the Board of Trade. And when he heard about the fire, he ran to the Board of Trade to save some important documents that were being housed there. And he was also hailed as a hero. And many people credited that act of heroism with allowing the Board of Trade to resume operations quickly after the fire. And so combined, we thought their stories were fascinating. We wanted to include them, just to give people some connection to different stories and different experiences. And so again, a lot to unpack there, but we go through the fire. And what's interesting is, the exhibit is obviously about the Chicago fire, but in a lot of ways, the meat of the story is the before and after, right? And so, the fire itself only lasts about 36 hours, right? It starts on the evening of Sunday, October 8th, and by the early morning of October 10th, Tuesday, it's out, right? It's burned from the O'Leary cottage all the way up to Fullerton. So the O'Leary cottage was on a Decoven, the site of the present day Fire Academy. So if you've ever been over there, kind of by the Dan Ryan before the Jane Byrne interchange, just off of Roosevelt, all the way up to Fullerton, which was the northernmost border of Chicago in 1871. So, cut across the city, burned approximately 3.5 square miles, and a total of 100,000 people left homeless because 17,500 structures are destroyed in the fire. And so what we saw when we were looking at this is scale. People had a difficult time sort of even conceptualizing what had happened. And so in our third section of the exhibition, we talk about the Smouldering City. And this is all about processing, right? How people sort of in the aftermath made sense of this experience. And so when we in the exhibit, we have a bridge, right? Because crossing the bridge from the river was such an important part of fleeing. And when you walk from the burning city section to the smoldering city section, right directly in front of you, you have a quite large video screen that has a slideshow of devastation, glass negatives of the fire ruins, right? And people talk about just how much of the city was destroyed in the fire, and you sort of see the entire city, laid to ruins. And people describe it as war, as Armageddon, as the end of the world, just to sort of get a sense of this the scale of this calamity. And this section is all about the ways people process that fire, right? And so one of the ways people processed it was through faith. And so we have a lot of references to people's sort of faith. We have before and after painting of a church that was, before and after the fire that was destroyed. And we talk about how people saw the building walls remaining standing, even though the inside of the church had burned down, as a symbol of the role of faith in rebuilding the church. Additionally, we have a painting of a church that had its dedication on October 8th, 1871. So they had their first church service the day of the fire, and the fire destroyed the church that night. And so again, how people process something like that through faith was an important thing. Additionally, we talk about how people made decisions about what came with them and what they took with them. And so we have this quote of a man named Samuel Greeley, and we ask, imagine going through the fire and surviving with nothing but the coat on your back, right? That's what happened to Samuel Greeley. Him and his family fled the fire. They lost everything. And this is the coat he wore through the fire. And we talk about the different sort of heirlooms, the jewelry, right? The dolls, the things that people took with them. And then across from that, we have the things that were left behind and recovered in the fire. And so we have a wall of cases of different things that were recovered from the fire, right? Toys, dishes, cutlery, you name it, just the things that people had left behind and the different stories behind it. And then probably really the spotlight of this section is a reproduction of the Great Chicago Fire cyclorama study. And the original Great Chicago Fire cyclorama was 378 feet by 40 feet. So this massive painting that was actually a commercial attraction that was opened in conjunction with the World's Fair, the 1893 World Columbian Exhibition. It was mounted in its own building on Michigan Avenue between Monroe and Madison, and they charged a quarter for you to go see it, which was not a little bit of money in 1893. And what we have in our collection is the study, which is like a draft in art. And so we had the original, and it was found in our collection about 8 years ago by our now retired curator at the museum. And we wanted to display the original, but the conservation cost, and then even before you get into mounting, were just prohibitive. So we reproduced it. I mean, it's still a very visually compelling experience, but we hope to be able to conserve the original. But we also have another painting from our collection in the space, and that's the Memories of the Fire by Julia Lemos, right? And this gets into another way people process disaster, right? They create art. They use their creative impulses to process and comprehend what they experienced. And so, in that, we ask, what would you create to process a difficult experience, right? Art, the way in which art and art therapy can be cathartic for people in a lot of ways. And then finally, we talk about the tent city, which is the homelessness problem, right? In the age of, there's no FEMA, right? There's no emergency response department. How do you respond to the humanitarian crisis of 100,000 people left unhoused? And so they distributed Civil War surplus tents originally, and then they built temporary barracks to help people. But it was clear that there was a humanitarian scale, a scale to this humanitarian crisis that there was no entity that currently existed, at least in governmentally, that could handle it. And so originally there was a committee that was going to be started of aldermen and city officials with some prominent people to deal with this. But soon it became clear that wasn't going to work, and we don't really have the exact answer of why. Many people believed that this was really the opportunity for the city's sort of money interest to take control of the city. They sort of argued that the aldermen were too corrupt, sort of too beholden to their immigrant and first generation constituencies, and that they couldn't be trusted to handle this task. And so them being the city's prominent elite citizens, so people like Joseph Medill and George Pullman and Marshall Field and other people who are sort of the city elite, they should be entrusted. And the vehicle they used to do this was the Chicago Relief and Aid Society. And so in the final section, the Rebuilt City, we talk about what does it mean to turn over the rebuilding of a city to that city's elite, right? So they're going to be responsible for this recovery, right? And we asked the question in the exhibit, in whose interest? In whose interest is Chicago going to be rebuilt? And for us, our research demonstrated that it was really going to be rebuilding the pre-fire status quo. And so the sort of inequalities that existed before the fire, instead of being addressed and attempts to remediate them, are really going to be affirmed and re-entrenched after the fire. And so we have this great letter from the Chicago Relief and Aid Society, and it says, for everyone seeking aid, apply St. Paul's rule. If any man will not work, neither let him eat, right? And so this is sort of the mindset of the fire in a lot of ways. The idea was no one deserved to be made worse off because of the fire, but no one deserved to be better off because of the fire. So it was all about returning people back to their station before the fire, right? And so if you had a little, you get a little, right? And if you had a lot, if you were middle class, if you were a certain status, you would get more to be returned to that status, right? Return to your station after the fire. And so they had what they called a special relief committee, right? And that special relief committee gave things like materials to restart a business. Now, in order to qualify for those materials, you had to have reference letters that basically said you owned a business from respectable citizens, right? And these were sort of the ideas that the Relief and Aid Society used to determine how they would deal with the rebuilding of the city after the fire. And so we unpack this, and we sort of ask people to think about, what does this mean? What does this mean as a way to be responsible for this, and manage this recovery? We also talk about the O'Leary myth and how this story is allowed to take on a life of its own, even though we know it's not true. Even in the aftermath of the fire, people know that this isn't true. And the reason why it's allowed to take up a life of its own is, as I mentioned before, Mrs. O'Leary is a stand-in. Even if she didn't do it's the fault of people like her. This is why this has befallen Chicago. And so she's sort of scapegoated in this tragic way. And then from there, we talk about the recovery, how in a lot of ways, Chicago is unique in the sense that the speed at which it recovered was remarkable. This is a city that bragged that by 1 year after fire, and certainly 2 years after fire, there were no traces that a fire had ever happened, right? And so this idea of Chicago as the Phoenix City, right? The city that had grown too fast, flew too close to the sun, and was destroyed as a result, but had resurrected from its own ashes even better than it was before, was deeply sort of entrenched in the self-conceptualization of Chicago. And so Chicago's sort of rebuilding over the next 2 decades was really sort of about putting the fire behind it and showing that the fire was not going to deter Chicago on its ascent as the fastest growing city in the world at the end of the 19th century. And so Chicago being selected to host the World's Columbian Exhibition for the United States in the same, almost in a similar way that, the Olympics host sites are decided. Congress picked the city to host the World's Fair, right? And they didn't pick New York, and they didn't pick Washington, D.C., and they didn't pick, San Francisco. They didn't pick these other cities. They picked Chicago, right? Because Chicago was the city that they wanted to use to show the world what America was. And so that prominence and that symbolism. And so we have on display this original broadside for Chicago Day, which is on the anniversary of the fire, right? And so Chicago Day and hosting the World's Fair says Chicago has officially recovered, and it has emerged better and stronger. And so our current flag that we have, if you've seen the Chicago flag, it has 4 stars, but when it was first created, it had 2 stars, right? And the 2 stars, one represented the fire and one represented the fair, right? So these 2 events, right, the lowest and the highest, really sort of representing Chicago's self-conceptualization and its sort of will, I will, right? The motto of Chicago was really sort of vibrantly, a part of its mythology. And so in this section as well, we talk about how, my sort of argument, I like bold claims in history that, really no other city has more been shaped by fire like Chicago. So we talk about other fires in the Chicago area and how those fires shaped fire safety, not only in Chicago, but around the country and the world. So we talk about the fire of 1874 and how that was the fire that actually led to the real firm establishment of fire safety codes in Chicago, because after that fire, the insurance underwriters essentially said, if you don't get your act together, we're no longer going to insure Chicago, underwrite fire insurance in Chicago. And so that's when you see the steel frames, that's when you see terracotta and those other sort of fire safety innovations of the late 19th century. We talk about the Iroquois Theater fire and how that led to things as simple as doors swinging outward, emergency exit doors swinging outward instead of swinging inward, which they did in Iroquois theater, which obviously led to the disasters. People could not pry the door open towards them with the throngs of people pushing towards the door. We talk about the Our Lady of Angels school fire, right? And how that led to fire safety innovations in school buildings. And in the exhibit, we have a case dedicated to this, and we have elements from the Our Lady of Angels Fire. And what we have is the homework of a young woman named Diane Kowacki, who died in the Our Lady of Angels school fire, and who was 9 years old. And how we got this in the collection is a family actually purchased a dresser in 2019 from a yard sale. When they got the dresser home, they were going through it, they found this young woman's homework in the back of this dresser. And so they decided to give it to the museum because they had did some research and knew about the Our Lady of the Angels fire. And I got it. And I reached out to the family. What had happened was her mother, who was in her 90s, was still alive and was actually being moved into a memory care facility, and had retired and relocated up to Wisconsin. And so her family had hired a yard sale, and she had one son remaining. And so I got the opportunity to speak to her son and let him know about this material and how we got it. And he gave us permission to have the material and keep it on display in the museum in this exhibition. So, a really sort of fascinating story that we have. And then we conclude with talking about fire safety today, right? And this, again, was another great thing that the Chicago Fire Department helped us with. How do we prevent fires? How do people can be safe today? And so we have a fire safety today where we talk about all the things in your kitchen that help prevent fires or help, reduce the damage for fires, fire extinguishers, fire alarm detectors, grounded electrical units, fire breaks in the walls, all these sort of things that we can do to be safe and prevent fire today. All right. So that is my presentation. Thank you so much for your time, and I would love the opportunity to answer any questions that you may have.
Yes. So would you prefer people put the questions in the chat, or would like them just to ask you directly?
We can just ask them directly or any way they're.
Okay, I'll unmute everybody. No, that should work. I guess everyone can unmute themselves. That should work, hopefully. All right, does anyone have any questions for Julius? Is it working, unmuting yourself? Let's see here. Yeah, is that working? Let's see. I'm trying to think if I can unmute you. Just see if you can unmute yourself.
Okay, that worked now.
All right, great.
I am unmuted, and I will ask my question. Do we know how many people lost their lives in the fire?
Yes, so the official count is 300. However, many people think that's a bit low, on the low end of the estimate, but that's sort of the official count. And many people think that a lot of people died in the fire, and their remains were burned, so they could not be counted. So, but the official sort of account from the investigation was 300 people.
Huh, that's amazing. It's so interesting to see the photographs and the images of like the burned out buildings and then just driving around in present day, right? And it's just fascinating. I'm sure I want to get to see the exhibit because it's just it looks just incredible. And just the fact that the Phoenix rising up, I mean, in terms of everything for Chicago, right? It was a huge time for the arts movement too, right? The Art Institute started up kind of right after this, that people realized that Chicago was, you know, going to be bigger and better, kind of like now, right? Build back better. Anyway, after the current times that we're in, but how did they decide, like, was it was there a central planning committee? I mean, how did they decide like which structures that would be worth saving, or did they just knock everything down and start over?
Oh yeah, no, they just pretty much knocked everything down and started over. In a lot of ways, people almost relish the opportunity to build bigger and grander buildings, and you see a lot of um, people doing things like building taller buildings. And so in many ways, the fire lays the foundation for the skyscrapers, which we begin to see in the next decade. And it's the ability to clear that land that allows that to happen. Additionally, the rubble from the fire literally becomes the space where Chicago gets more land as they push the rubble into the lake. And present day Streeterville neighborhood is actually the fire, you know, just to give you some context, where the water tower is now, that area was only 2 blocks away from the shore in 1871. So everything, you know, Northwestern Hospital is all built on the rubble of the fire. And so that gives you just a sense, it's literally allows Chicago to grow.
And so all the displaced people, did they then move west for a while? Is that kind of why you see, you know, around Midway Airport, there's all those old churches, right? That I mean, is that where people sort of relocated and then came back east as things were built, or how did that all work?
Yeah, so basically what happened after the fire is you have people who are able to, you know, find temporary shelter, largely in short order, right where they are. So there's a shelter committee. First they distribute tents, and then they build barracks, and then they give people the material to rebuild their homes in fairly short order where they were destroyed at. So it doesn't take very long before many of the residents are able to be back where they were. You do have some spreading of the population westward is where you start to see the city expand west. But it's not very long before people are back to where they are. And Chicago continues to grow very rapidly after the fire, right? Just to give you, you know, some context, you know, at the time of the Civil War, there's only about 100,000 people in Chicago, and by the fire, there's over 300,000 people in Chicago, and you know, there's a million people in Chicago by the turn of the century. So this sort of rapid growth continues largely unabated even after the fire, and it doesn't take very long.
Thank
And
you,
how,
Julius. This was really very interesting. And what struck me was that a few weeks ago, I listened to a talk about the Great Fire of London, which happened about 2 years earlier than the one in Chicago. But there were so many similarities because all the buildings there were made of wood. And when they rebuilt, they used brick. And while the people were not in the city after the fire, they were living on the outskirts in tents. So it seems that maybe Chicago learned something from the London fire.
Oh, absolutely, right. And so you sort of see so many similarities with that story, right? Sort of how you deal with the disaster, and how you manage the sort of recovery, again, in the age where there's not a lot of central bureaucracy to do so. And one of the things that we reached out to is because this was a fire anniversary exhibition, we actually had the curator, Mariel Jeter, who curated the exhibit on the London fire for their 350th anniversary at the Museum of London. She was a consultant for us on this fire. So, this idea of talking about fire anniversaries, right? And how you sort of commemorate that, she was invaluable for us because she had done it before.
Oh, that's great to know. Well, I'm glad I brought up that fact then. And your talk was really very interesting. I'm so pleased that you put it out there on Eventbrite, because that's how I found it. I live in Boston, so it was good to be with you today.
Oh, well, thank you from Boston. Yes, we have we've been just fascinated by sort of the interest. This is a national and international story. And one of the things I showed that I didn't talk about was how was a book plate. And so before the fire of 1871, there was no public libraries in Chicago. There were these sort of private reading rooms in Chicago, and the Chicago Historical Society had that same model. So there was no sort of public library anyone could walk into and check out a book. And after the fire, someone in London decided to start a book drive, and Queen Victoria donated a book about her husband to the book drive. And so it ended up being a big thing in London, and they shipped all these books over to Chicago, and that became the basis of the Chicago Public Library. So there's all these sort of national and international connections to people who really came to Chicago's aid after the fire.
Vicki has a question.
Yeah. You talked about some of the myths around the Chicago fire, and I've always wondered about something. I've been told over the years that in the process of reconstruction after the fire, that the streets and sidewalks of the newly rebuilt areas were raised to allow for sewer and what have you. And that when you visit neighborhoods of the city like Pilsen or west of Ogden, for example, and you see houses that are below grade, that those were buildings that were built before the fire. Is that true or myth?
Yeah, no, that is true. Absolutely. So they did raise the city to allow for, as you mentioned, sewer and other sort of materials down there. A lot of things they began, paving over some of the wood paver blocks that they had with, cement and then asphalt eventually. But even in around Lincoln Park, you can see some of the pre-fire cottages there, and they are significantly below grade. So not only are they sort of small houses, they're lower than the typical house in Chicago, and it's exactly for that reason. So that's absolutely correct.
I am greatly relieved that all of my out-of-town visitors have been given the correct information over the years. Thank you so much.
Yes. You can feel confident you've given them the correct information.
Oh, that's great.
Julius, first of all, thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed the way that you took an historical event and made it really relevant for contemporary listeners and I'm sure viewers of your exhibition through bringing up issues that are still very important today: inequity, immigration, disaster preparedness. And I've been sitting on this question. I couldn't quite get unmuted, and now you've partially covered it, but I was wondering if you have any information on how the destruction and homelessness caused by the fire impacted growth of suburbs like Evanston. or did it not?
Yeah, it's interesting because, suburb is a very interesting concept for this period. So, Hyde Park was a suburb of Chicago in 1871. Because the southernmost border was 39th, which we now refer to as Pershing, right? That was the southernmost border. Fullerton, the northernmost edge of Lincoln Park was a suburb. So, I mean, what's the border? So, of that suburb. So it is an interesting question. I don't think we necessarily see the fire connected to suburban growth in that same way. Certainly, the fire leads to growth outward, and then you have annexation in the 1880s that allows the city to get larger. And Hyde Park and other areas. So the city begins to grow out towards Evanston. And that sort of is a trajectory that begins for the fire. But I don't think you can necessarily make the connection from like the fire and then people who were displaced from the fire and moved to the suburbs. I think there's a bit more time in between those phenomena.
Great, thank you.
Okay, I just have one other quick question, which hopefully is quick, but so how did the whole funding model work? Like, did the city issue bonds or, I mean, I know they had the wealthy families, but I mean, how did they fund this extremely rapid growth? I mean,
It was 100% charity, right? Which is remarkable to think of. It was people from all over the world sending money, sending materials, sending aid. And someone just had to manage it, right? And so, we always talk about this, the Relief and Aid Society, having been the really only charitable organization in Chicago, was the only entity with the manpower, the skill, even the frame of reference to do so. And then, like I said, the board, people like Marshall Field, who were in the wholesale business, knew about storing and moving large amounts of goods about. George Pullman, and being in the railroad, he had access to the infrastructure necessarily to move these goods. And so in a lot of ways, these are the kinds of skills and resources and insights that you need to be able to do these things. And so it was 100% charity. There's no governmental appropriation or anything like that. And so it that makes it all the more remarkable.
No, it's true. A different time, but oh my gosh. Great. Well, this really was just so exciting and interesting, even though I've been around a few decades. So the story isn't new, but I think I can't wait to come and see it, because I want to see how you digitally mastered all those. I remember the dioramas from the years gone back, decades gone back. So I'm really excited to see how you put your own, spin on all of this and your expertise on everything. So thank you so much. Thanks.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you for everyone else too for signing in. And I'm so excited. Somebody found an Eventbrite in Boston.
Yes, awesome.
But anyway, and we have more In Focus lectures planned. So watch your e-blast and on Eventbrite, and we'll go forward with that. So thanks again. Thanks everyone.